sorry to interrupt. We just want to let you know you need to turn on your mic.
Right. Thank you so much. Okay, let me go back. So welcome to the 2022 Online Economic History Workshop with a panel on civilian response to war. I am Anna Turprat from the University of California at Merced. And today, Gianni Marciante from the University of Warwick is presenting on the role of coercive nation building, fostering organized crime. After Gianni speaks, then Felipe Valencia Caicedo from the University of British Columbia is going to provide some comments. And finally, we will finish the panel with the panelists responding to comments from Felipe Valencia Caicedo and you, the audience. You can submit questions for consideration by posting them to Twitter with the hashtag OEHW2022 or by submitting them on YouTube. I recommend submitting questions as soon as you think of them so that I have time to read through them before the start of questions and answers. Remember, all the work you're seeing is work in progress. This is a job market paper, so especially questions and feedback can help the presenter improve their research. So thank you, Gianni. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Anna. Thanks for the introduction. So let me share my screen. Okay. All right. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone, wherever you are. In the next 15 minutes, I'm gonna present my paper, which is a job market paper on the historical nation building process in Sicily, the origin of the Sicilian mafia, and the possible connection between these two historical events. Okay, let me start by providing you with the definition of nation building just to level the playing field and avoid any confusion. By nation building in this paper, I refer to any process that is meant to create a community in which citizens remain connected to each other through some shared values and a shared history, despite never meeting one another. In general, nation-building policies aim to lower intergroup conflict and improve political stability. And some scholars, like Dehdari Gehring very recently, have identified two broad categories to distinguish between different types of nation-building. Benevolent nation-building policies on the one hand, like public investments in infrastructure, that help minority groups get connected with the rest of the society more easily. And on the other hand, more importantly, coercive nation-building policies recently occurred in several countries, for instance, Ukraine and China, as you can see from these news headlines. By coercive nation-building policies, I mean policies that help shape a sense of national identity through the restriction of either personal or political freedoms. So policies like segregation, language bans, censorship, or military conscription, the key policy of interest in this paper, are all different forms of coercive nation building. Some scholars have identified instances of cultural resistance following the implementation of these coercive policies. In my paper, I wonder whether there can be some local conditions that facilitate or hinder these acts of cultural resistance. And in particular, I wonder whether there can be some role played by providers of private protection in supporting these forms of cultural resistance to forced assimilation. There could be, indeed, demand for protection from government law enforcers in order to preserve the cultural identity of the targeted minorities. And the demand for protection from the government, willing to homogenize the population, could be also an increasing function in the government's efforts to nation build. This leads to the following research questions. Can coercive nation-building policies foster organized crime? And if so, can this conceptual framework be used to partly explain, at least, the early emergence of the Sicilian mafia? Several mafia experts have concluded in the last decades that this quite infamous criminal syndicate at the end of the 19th century managed to spread up across the Sicilian island by exploiting its competitive advantage in the supply of protection in some thriving economic sectors like citrus production and sulfur extraction, always in a context of weak institutions, so always in a context in which public authorities were almost never able to guarantee property rights protection. The existing literature on the origin of the Sicilian mafia, though, doesn't shed light on the drivers of mafia's emergence during a critical juncture in the Italian history, which is the Italian unification process. For those of you who are not very familiar with the unification process of Italy, I have prepared only 3 maps that summarize pretty much the entire story that you need to know to understand my paper. So at the beginning of 1860, that's how Italy looked like. 3 big kingdoms, mainly. One in the north, called the Kingdom of Sardinia, another one in the south, known as Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and another one in the middle, called Papal State, the Kingdom of the Church. In May 1860, General Garibaldi, pushed by the elites of the Kingdom of Sardinia in the north, moved to Sicily to start the annexation of southern Italy, which was pretty much completed in 1861, as you see in the second map, and was fully completed 10 years later when Rome and the territories close to Venice became part of the unified Kingdom of Italy. That's pretty much what you need to know. Back in the 1860s, Sicily and the other southern Italian regions saw the country unification more as a conquest by the northern elites leading the unification process, rather than as an opportunity for them to improve their living standards. And as a result, nation building was deemed as vital for the survival of the new Kingdom of Italy by the new central government. And among the many nation building policies that were put in place starting from 1861, military conscription was arguably one of the most important ones, especially for Sicily, a region that was completely new to this reform back then. And the nation building rationale behind conscription became quite evident soon after its introduction, if you read official statements made by public authorities like the Italian Minister of War, which claimed that the National Army was going to be and was deemed to become very soon the true school of the nation. So based on this set of information, I claim in this paper that the Sicilian mafia rose initially in part in response to a coercive nation-building policy that backfired during a radical institutional change. I also argue that this historical event occurred through changes in the market for protection in Sicily. In particular, the introduction of conscription in 1861 generated an increase in the demand for private protection that eventually paved the way for the early rise of the Sicilian mafia, for 2 reasons. When conscription was put in place in 1861, many Sicilians reacted by fleeing in the Sicilian countryside to avoid the draft. This generated a huge increase in the phenomenon of banditry throughout Sicily. To tackle the high rates of draft evasion shown in the aftermath of this policy, the central government decided in 1863 to conduct a repressive military campaign to capture Sicilian deserters and draft evaders, using brute force. According to many historians, indeed, the brutality and the harshness of the military measures carried out by the soldiers in 1863 in Sicily led to a decline in state legitimacy and an increase in demand for protection from law enforcers looking for draft evaders. So eventually, the combined effect of lower state legitimacy and higher demand for protection from the government helped the mafia emerge and flourish during the second half of the 19th century. To provide some empirical evidence in support of this story, I set up an instrumental variables framework in which I instrument each town's exposure to the repression campaign of 1863 with its distance to the shortest route connecting targeted towns using the pre-existing road network. And I'll be more specific about what I mean by shortest route and targeted towns in a few slides. What I find is a significant impact of exposure to repression in 1863 on the probability of experiencing mafia presence at the town level 12 years after the repression campaign, and also roughly 30 years later in the persistence analysis that I include at the end of the paper. I also find that repressed towns were characterized by a lower trust in the central government after 1863 compared to non-repressed towns. And finally, I find that areas that were more exposed to repression saw a decline in the draft evasion rate after 1863 compared to areas less hit by the government repression episode, which seems to suggest overall that the change in the demand for mafia generated by lower state legitimacy and higher mafia legitimacy played a larger role in the emergence of this criminal syndicate rather than the changes in the size of the criminal labor force due to the draft evasion phenomenon first and the repression campaign soon after. In the empirical part of the paper, I start with a very simple linear probability model to provide some motivational correlations. This empirical model is based on two indicator variables, both defined at the town level. One on the left-hand side, mafia presence in 1875, and one on the right-hand side, exposure to repression in 1863. And as you can see already visually, the correlation between these two dummies seems to be positive, and in the paper I show that this is also robust to the use of a large battery of confounders in the analysis and the use of different estimation techniques. Okay, let me move to the description of the data quickly, and let me start by describing this repression campaign of 1863. This military expedition started in June and was concluded by mid-November, roughly, of that year. And here is a pretty much exhaustive list of what happened during those months in Sicily. I'm not going to spend a lot of detail describing the several measures put in place by the soldiers. They were very rough and brutal sometimes. Killings and tortures occurred in several instances, as happened, for instance, to the guy known as Antonio Cappello, shown in this figure, with more than 150 small circular burns on his body. This guy was tortured by the soldiers on suspicion of simulating mutinies in order to avoid enlisting. This guy, in reality, was clearly unfit to serve in the military, but the troops just didn't trust him because they thought he was faking his disease in order to avoid the draft. And so they tortured him. To identify repression episodes in Sicily in 1863, I use two primary sources: the military reports and the personal letters written by the army general in charge of the operations occurred in Sicily in that year, General Giuseppe Govone, and also daily Sicilian newspapers published from June to December of that year and providing local coverage of what was going on during those months. I use both pro-government and anti-government newspapers, and I focus on some specific keywords like complaint, town under siege, arrest, military cordon, to clearly understand the time of repression, the location of these repression episodes, and also the different forms of repression occurred. The repression campaign started roughly in the middle of Sicily, here in June 26th. And then, since then, troops started moving in a clockwise direction around Sicily. They reached the southern coast first, then they entered the western province of Trapani in September, and then they concluded the expedition in the upper part of the island, the Palermo province, by mid-November. So they started roughly in this point here, and then they moved clockwise. I'm going to leverage the information on the direction of the troops' movement on the Sicilian territory in the IV analysis. So spoiler, don't forget these 4 graphs. When it comes to my dependent variable, instead, I use information from a parliamentary inquiry that was conducted between 1874 and 1876 on the social and economic conditions of Sicily, and was named after the 2 members of the parliament who actually pushed for this inquiry, Borsani and Boffadini. This inquiry was structured through questionnaires that were sent by the central government to a large number of local authorities in Sicily, including local prefects, the local authorities in charge of maintaining public order in their province of jurisdiction. These Sicilian prefects, there were 7 of them in 1875, received a questionnaire from Rome in which they were asked how the mafia used to operate in their province, which social classes were likely to fall under mafia's influence, and crucially, which were the main mafia-ridden towns and the most dangerous mafiosi living in them. I exploit the information provided by the Sicilian prefects on those questionnaires to construct a binary variable equal to 1 if a town is explicitly mentioned as a mafia-infiltrated town by one of these prefects, and equal to 0 otherwise. And as you can see, there's some within-province variation in mafia presence, which I'm able to exploit by using province fixed effects that turn out to be also quite helpful in order to compare municipalities characterized by a fairly homogeneous level of institutional or prefect quality. And they are also province fixed effects are also very helpful to avoid my estimates to be driven by these pretty large differences between Eastern and Western Sicily that you can already spot visually. Okay, in terms of baseline empirical strategy, as I was saying at the beginning, I use a very simple linear probability model, including as confounders all the other well-known determinants of early mafia presence already emphasized in the literature. So suitability for citrus production, presence of sulfur, geographic controls, land concentration, and banditry as a sort of proxy for pre-existing criminal activity. And the correlation that I find in each specification, changing the set of confounders every time, is always positive and significant, no matter which specification you consider. I'm gonna skip all the robustness checks for the sake of time, but they are all in the paper if you are interested. Let me move to the IV analysis now. In the IV analysis, I exploit information on the military plan of attack from the personal letters and reports written by Govone. In these notes, eventually you realize that Govone himself said to the troop at the beginning of the expedition to spend very few days and a very short time in their movement on the Sicilian territory, as you see from this extract posted here in this on this slide. I leverage the information on the speed and this critical factor in this military expedition to construct an instrument for the exposure to repression, which is basically the distance between each town and the shortest route that could have been taken by the troops during the campaign, using the pre-existing road network. By shortest route, I mean the least cost path connecting towns characterized by a military barrack already before the repression campaign of 1863. Basically big towns or garrison towns in general. Most of them were department capitals, so important places in Sicily in 1863. And by setting up this network of least cost paths connecting garrison towns together, I recall the so-called inconsequential places approach introduced by Redding and Turner in 2015. By doing so, I define an instrument which selects towns that were more likely to fall subject to repression only because of their unfavorable location along an optimal path connecting garrison towns. In the interest of time, let me show you how this instrument looks like. I'll show you the estimates and then I'll wrap up. So in black, you see triangles indicating garrison towns visited by the army in 1863. The gray triangles were not involved in the repression campaign, so I'm just ignoring them. The red dotted line indicates the shortest route connecting garrison towns, conditional on the chronological order in which these garrison towns were met by the soldiers. Remember the 4 graphs I showed at the beginning. And finally, as you see, the closeness to the red dotted line seems to predict quite well the actual exposure to the repression campaign of 1863. So I use the logarithmic transformation of the distance from the red dotted line as an excluded instrument to predict actual exposure to repression, and then I use the predicted exposure to repression to explain the variation in mafia presence in 1875. And the coefficients are again positive and significant. Now with also a causal interpretation. In the most demanding specification, I see that repressed towns were saw an increase in the probability of mafia presence equal roughly to 79 percentage points, which is a quite sizable effect if compared with the mean value of mafia presence in that year. And I have also a bunch of robustness, which I don't have time to go through, but they are all in the paper if you want. Okay, so just to wrap up, In this paper, I document a positive and significant impact of violent exposure to coercive nation building on mafia presence in Sicily during a critical juncture in the Italian history. This seems to be driven by changes in the or decline in the level of state legitimacy in areas more exposed to coercive nation building. And I believe these findings are important also because they are quite timely and they are very relevant when it comes to coercive nation building policies being implemented nowadays in several parts of the world. China and Ukraine, just to mention two famous examples. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Gianni, for your great presentation. Now, Felipe, Valencia, Caicedo will discuss this presentation. Floor is yours, Felipe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna, and I reiterate the thanks to Gianni for a great presentation, and also thanks to the organizers for inviting me to discuss this paper. Let me start with one caveat, which is this is a full-blown job market paper, so it has all of the checks and balances and polishness that you can expect for a paper of such caliber, and there's really a lot to like. So let me kind of like start with the big picture and then try to zoom in into some qualms or some interpretations that maybe would raise a bit of discussion. So I guess the first thing is just to note that this is obviously a crowded literature, as Gianni was pointing at the beginning. So I think what's new here and what the value added is here, it's twofold. One, in terms of topics. I mean, I guess many scholars, you saw the list, they have thought about the origins of the mafia in Sicily. This is not only in economics, like this is actually a big question in the social sciences, the big work of Gambetta. I think from there's a lot of stuff that has emanated. I think what's more novel here is the nation building argument, which is kind of a way of intersecting the work on the Sicilian mafia and a big topic now in economics, which is nation building and how are these things interacting. So I found that that's quite novel. And I think what's really new here it's this coercive repression angle. So when we think about nation building, I think we associate it with positive traits, positive connotations, but this need not be the case. Like what happens if your state is a bit repressive, as some of the cases that you were mentioning and motivating with, and what happens if the state needs people to fight? I mean, how am I going to feel about that? And of course, I mean, this is on the conceptual side. You couldn't do anything or test any of these hypotheses if you didn't have the data. So I think the step zero contribution of this paper is a more econ history contribution, which is okay, great. I mean, here are these theories, but let me introduce this new data and obviously with your interpretation. But I think that this would be something that could be helpful, again, in a very active literature down the road. So I had some questions, like just guiding questions of how can we better think about the setting, and I called this like the mechanics, like what is it really that is going on. So the first thing could be it's the pressure of the government trying to recruit. So that's kind of like one side, like in this case, demand for recruits. But the other thing, I mean, it's kind of like an equilibrium game here, or it's the response of the population through evasion. So, I mean, is it that the government is pushing more in these areas, or with a homogeneous push, people feel differently about the government, and that's what's like making kind of like the whole effect of the appearance of the mafia. And this obviously it's important for endogeneity, of like really pinning down what is the endogeneity, because it's like an equilibrium game between like the government and the population. And obviously that's something that's going to come through the identification. So it's further complicated by the fact that the government might need more soldiers or more recruits in areas that are harder to control. I I mean, that's the whole point. I mean, maybe if everything is peaceful, you don't need to recruit people, but you kind of, I mean, you're in this catch-22 where you wanna and need to recruit people in areas that are particularly complicated. And this is obviously the context of the Sicilian mafia, but it's very much today. I mean, if you think about Ukraine or if you think about policing in the US, I mean, the whole supply of crime is also endogenous. So obviously this is gonna need an identification strategy, which is what you saw and what we can discuss next. It was not super clear to me, but how exactly recruitment works. And I had a small comment that there was one paragraph that was very nice, but it was almost at the end of the paper of like, what's like the nitty gritty of recruitment? So is it local recruitment, but you also serve there? And again, this is a big topic in like US policing, because one of the things that you can do is that you recruit in place county A, but you serve in county B, et cetera, et cetera. And this is important for the transmission of the effect, because are you only paying the costs of these recruitment services and kind of like the bads, like you have to send your kid to the army, or are you also facing the goods? Like, oh, now there's improved security. So, I mean, this could generate both virtuous cycles, like now I'm part of the police and the police is so good, or vicious circles, which is now I send my kid to the police and my neighborhood is still very unsafe, okay? And we discussed that a little bit if you're interested in the appendix of our Triple Alliance paper of what is the actual nature of recruitment. And I think when we talk about war, this is an important component. Identification, you saw, I mean, it's kind of a classic game in more in the urban literature. So Gianni constructs this network. So it's a least cost path. So kind of like are assuming that all the geographic factors are exogenous, or at least exogenous to the problem at hand. And the specific thing is this, what the urban economists call the inconsequential units approach, which is if you're connecting town A and B with a road, that could be fairly endogenous, like imagine New York to Chicago or New York to DC. But where the actual road goes, it's a little bit exogenous, like why a bit to the left or a bit to the right, okay? So that's I think it's kosher. And we have something a little bit similar with Ana in the context of the Spanish Civil War. Because I think what's cool in your case is that you have where the troops were supposed to go, like these plans of attacks. And I think that's really a value added on top of the urban stuff. And so I don't know if you actually know where the troops actually passed. So, but maybe you want to take a look at our paper. We try to like kind of disentangle a bit, like is it where the troops go or where the troops were supposed to go? And some smaller comments would be more on the road side, which is, so when you do that, do you still control for roads or do you still control for the early roads? I think that this, just because it's like kind of like the core of the identification, could be discussed a bit more in the paper. And like at least on a first pass read, it was not super clear to me what exactly was going on in terms of the control set. And because obviously these supply routes, I mean, A could be interpreted as state capacity. So the state wants soldiers, but the state is also able to build roads. So then it's part of this big nation building effort. But on the mafia side, I mean, I know that this is a different type of trafficking, and this was more protection than actually narco trafficking and stuff, which is like the modern view of the mafia. And these routes might be important themselves. And obviously you need some endogeneity for the instrument to hold, at least some endogeneity that like, I mean, a first stage more than an endogeneity, but these are things that I think could be spelled out a little bit more in the paper. Then the third big thing that I have is on mechanisms, and many of these type of papers have one nice baseline result, and then okay, there needs to be a mechanism, so it's a little bit of an afterthought of results that are weaker, variables that are less complete, something like that. Here is exactly the opposite. So here I thought that the mechanism section was super strong, because then you enter this whole potentially even bigger game, which is repression and trust, okay? And so I thought that this is something that is not emphasized as much in the paper. So maybe in the intro or in the writing, like I think it should almost have equal weight, or maybe it's part of another baseline result. I mean, I just thought that that to say that these mechanisms, because sometimes we think that mechanisms is something smaller or less robust, it's a bit unfair because there's like a lot of meat in this part of the paper. And you use this trust as politics. So this idea that maybe turnout in voting is trust. So this is nice, but it also combines kind of like this bigger thing of like, is this the politics side or is this the culture side? And it's a measure that combines both by definition. So I don't know if maybe it would be worth, it might be hard, but to think a little bit about more quote unquote independent measures of trust. And I think Anna here would be the expert, so maybe she can chime in later, or you can talk to each other of what could be some early measures of trust that are not only voting. So if you want to kind of expand on this side. Of course, I mean, if the mechanisms part is so strong, then it's going to be important to clarify, like, okay, is this about repression? Is it about military draft evasion? Is this about the mafia? And you have some nice discussions, but I think that then kind of the worry there is like, oh, maybe there's a direct effect, so it's trust to mafia and not the opposite. And this again, just because the mechanism section is so strong, I think should feed back to the main results, and so that it's very clear like what's kind of like causing what, because there's one identification strategy at the end. So you might want to think about instrumenting the mechanisms, etc., etc. I mean, it's just, I thought that there was a lot here that could be further explored. And let me just briefly mention the small points in the interest of time, so also that we have a broader discussion. This is more kind of like in the writing. I think you can just have a data appendix so that you don't need to wait until page 24 for the real action. I guess people are impatient. And there's a nice paper in Garibaldi in Sicily, like not really what you're doing. I know that you have it as a control, but I thought that it was close enough by Gemma Lax, Dominic Ronner, and Alessandro Saya that might be worth it. And we are working on state capacity in the Spanish Empire with Giorgio Luis Leopoldo and Juan David. And it's a very different setting, but while I was reading the paper, we asked the exact same questions like in our heads, and we're trying to like grapple with the same thing, which is, how can state building backfire? And in the Latin American case, like this eventually leads to independence. So you might want to like take a look, and we can discuss more. And then there was that crucial paragraph on recruitment. On page 44, I understood perfectly what was going on, but I thought that it was important to have that information before. Okay, so let me close it there. Great paper. I mean, again, full-blown job market paper, so hard to criticize. Please read it, because 15 minutes of presentation is not fair for something that has so much stuff going on. I really enjoyed it, and again, let me just close it here so that we can have a broader discussion as well.
Thanks a lot, Felipe. Really, thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Felipe. Gianni, do you want first to respond maybe to some of Felipe's remarks? We also have some questions from the audience, so we can organize our time the way you prefer.
I can just take a couple of minutes to go through some points maybe, and then go to the other questions.
Yes, sounds good.
Yeah, so you're right. So eventually the order of the material needs to be rearranged. Important stuff maybe actually comes quite late in the paper, and may deserve closer attention and much more relevance straight from the beginning. About the more, say, significant issues that you have identified, I agree with anything you said in general. The demand and supply for recruitment is something interesting to investigate. You are right. Eventually, the recruitment worked in a kind of weird way. It was entirely structured in a nation building rationale. They really wanted, as you were drawing an example, they were really trying to recruit people in region A to have it serve in the military in region B, with region B being 500 kilometers away from home. Just for the sake of mixing up Italians and having people interact with other people with different traditions, speaking different dialects, and so pushing them to feel more Italian as a result of being exposed to other Italians. It was a complete failure in military terms, because it was hard to move troops around Italy when 1866 arrived and the Third Italian Independence War started. That's why, according to some historians, Italy lost that war, because you had to move Sicilians to the north of the country, and that required a lot of time. But yes, so that's something in general that Southerners and Sicilians precisely didn't really like, and that is something that moved and pushed many of them in the countryside and raised the draft evasion massively in Sicily. So they were kind of paying the costs, as you were highlighting in your discussion slides. They were mostly paying the costs of recruitment and dealing with culturally different Italians, rather than enjoying the benefits of being protected or having a larger army or a larger set of government law enforcers to protect them. And yes, so the issue with the roads, I agree with you. That's something that could be endogenous in pre-existing criminal activity, and also the presence of some important roads would be a pull factor for criminal organizations before the unification. I kind of deal with that issue by controlling for the distance from commercial roads, the main roads existing there, and the ones that could attract bandits, regardless of repression or regardless of what happened with the unification. But in general, the presence of a road would be kind of endogenous anyway, regardless of the road being a commercial road, a high quality road, or a low quality road. That's why I was thinking of constructing another alternative instrument using only the Human Mobility Index by Omer Ozak, which maybe doesn't take, actually not maybe, it doesn't take roads into account at all, but just focuses on topological factors that eventually allow people to cross cells on a specific territory more easily or in a harder way. That's something that I'm working on in the section of robustness controls. And when it comes to politics, absolutely. So eventually, that's something that the mafia eventually could have gained a lot from. So mafia infiltration into politics would be something that could make my story way more complicated than the way I put it down at the moment. That's something that in reality happened in the 1870s, according from what I've read in history books. So mafia started favoring specific candidates that were willing to pay mafiosi to get protection and avoid any interference by other candidates who were not willing to pay the bribes to these mafiosi. So there was a lot of electoral canvassing associated with mafia starting from 1870s, not in the first decade of the Kingdom of Italy. So I'm collecting data on electoral turnout also for the other elections to see if there is some maybe switch in the sign associated with the coefficient of electoral turnout, of repression explaining electoral turnout. Maybe there could be some increase in electoral turnout in repressed areas because mafia eventually becomes more powerful there and elections get rigged as mafia become more powerful in those territories. So that's also part of the work in progress on this project. And yeah, and for the rest, I took your I take your comments and we can discuss more later if you want. But thanks a lot in general, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gianni. We have some comments from the audience that I would proceed to read first. So there is one about considering the mafia not only as a criminal organization, but also more of a political organization fighting for independence. So they're asking whether does the mafia elect only to be a criminal organization operating within the existing government, or does it also attempt to organize an independence movement? Why or why not does the mafia push for independence?
Yes, so Unfortunately, I didn't have time to go through the historical background slide. That was quite meaningful, and I apologize for not being very precise on that. There was some proto-mafia, as Sicilian historians call it, before the unification. There were some pseudo-mafia gangs already there. They were much involved, and actually almost predominantly involved in the business of protection against livestock robberies. It was a very rudimentary business in which they had a sort of monopoly. When the unification occurred and the repression of 1863 actually started, you see a structural transformation of these proto-mafia gangs, becoming much more involved in the business of protection and extending the set of services provided to the local population because of the gain in legitimacy, as a result of the decline in state legitimacy. As mafia became the entity to go to in order to solve any problem that local population had, mafia became a proper organization. It really never pushed for a full autonomy of Sicily because there was no need for it eventually. I'm relying on what historians say on this issue. They just changed the way they were providing services. They were making deals and running their affairs, and they were just turning to the highest bidders anytime they had someone looking for protection of any sort, from the regulation of dispute resolutions, conflict resolutions, and electoral canvassing, as I was saying before. They just did their own stuff without pushing for the autonomy of Sicily as a result. And they became powerful because people gave them legitimacy. That's it.
I see. Thank you. Interesting. More questions. Someone from Twitter is asking whether is the lack of trust caused by the repression, or has the presence of the mafia in those towns result in corruption that leads to poorly run governments, leading to distrust in governance?
Yes, so that's what Felipe was hinting correctly. The link between trust and repression could go both ways, of course. In the empirics, I account for pre-existing trust in institutions in order to disentangle the specific effect of repression on trust. I have proxies for trust in the government in 1860, like the presence of a Garibaldino. There was also something highlighted by Felipe in his discussion, and also electoral turnout before the repression. I always account for those confounders to deal with the presence of low trust before my treatment. And eventually, the IV should take account of any endogeneity related to the relationship between trust and repression and mafia later on, when it comes to repression. For the mechanisms analysis, I take Felipe's advice on the need for an IV, which could bolster the confidence on the mechanism much more, and that's something I need to think more about, but perfectly fair point.
Yes, thank you. Another question from Twitter, this one more on external validity and application to current events in Russia. So they're asking, if we were to extrapolate your findings today, what is your predicted effect of forced mobilization in the Donbas region by the Donetsk People's Republic? How would you expect it to be different or the same as forced mobilization in Russia?
Yes, so let me start by saying that I'm not very familiar with criminal activity in Ukraine at the moment, but if some criminal activity led by criminal organizations in Ukraine has already been well established on that territory, it could be that maybe there could be some unintended consequences of this coercive nation building policy pushed by the Russian government in those areas, with these criminal organizations eventually rising as a result of more people relying on them to get protection from the Russians and the Russian homogenization policies overall. I'm not sure that eventually the main people in charge of promoting these coercive policies would be very receptive to my findings, since we are talking about people ruling over not very democratic economies, but this could provide some insight in general in other contexts in which maybe policymakers are more interested in what can happen given the implementation of specific nation-building policies.
Thank you.
Can I interject on that one? I mean, because I
Yes.
think that what your paper speaks to this huge question of like how to build a state. And then, of course, you're finding like these effects that are very negative in Sicily, but it could have gone very different ways. I mean, like there is a map of one Italy today where Sicily is part of. I think what's kind of interesting in your case is that what is the price to build a one Italy, which is a fairly modern concept? I mean, also with Germany, like these are modern states. But then, okay, some areas are going to have to pay the price more than others. But the outcomes could have been there is one Italy and there's a separate Sicily, or there is a more virtuous circle between like the north and the south, or this tension where like, yes, you have one country, but like there's some regions that are not part of this country. So I think that for that question in Ukraine, it's like, I mean, yeah, how do you build a state and what is a legitimate state? And I think that when Russia asks something to its people, it's different now than when Ukraine asks something to its people. And then you start this thing of like war mobilization and compensations and kind of like you're building a social contract. So, I mean, I think that you have this microcosm of Sicily, but I mean, the question is huge. It's like, how do you build a state and what are the costs of state or nation building? So I think in that sense, like it has a lot to say about Ukraine.
Yeah, in the end, it's all about legitimacy. Just trying to summarize 75 pages of paper in just one word, it's about legitimacy and the ability to build legitimacy by the policymaker who is interested in homogenizing the population and avoiding any breakup through different forms. That's the goal of nation building eventually. No?
And how, if you are a Sicilian person, if you have a Piedmontese person, I mean, he might as well be Austrian. So, I mean, it's not like it sounds very one country, but I mean, it was different countries back then. So I think that's where it has like the more general interest.
Yes, exactly. And on this note that Felipe was talking about, I got also very fascinated by the framework of the paper on the coercive state building, etc. And when I saw the initial maps of your papers, it seemed that the eastern part of Sicily was much less affected by repression and therefore by mafia developing, etc. And I was wondering whether if it was because they were already culturally closer to central or northern Italians than Western Sicilians to begin with, whether they identified already more with the like homogeneous, if there is something to call like that, Italian culture or identity. I don't know. I know, for instance, that within Italy, there are tons of dialects. I don't know if even within Sicily, there are different dialects that you could measure some sort of cultural distance with the more central Italian language to grasp whether there is this like cultural clash that you started motivating your paper with, underlying this very different repression intensity between the east and the west of Sicily. Maybe there are even measures in the past, the dialects, or I don't know, some sort of public good that was offered back in the 19th century, some sort of stamps or post-service that you could identify more by consuming that local good with like the more central Italian thing or not. I don't know. These are just ideas because I found the framework really fascinating.
Absolutely. Thanks for the assist, and that's actually what I'm doing somehow by digitizing conscription lists and the birth certificates, both before and after the repression, just to see if there was some change in the attitudes toward the central government, which we can think of people from the north, so fundamentally different from Sicilians in that historical period. Looking at change in name distribution over the local population. In general, from what I can see, using the draft evasion rates at the department level, which is what I have at the moment, There was less draft evasion to begin with in the east of Sicily, apart from the very big towns, Catania and Messina, on the eastern coast. The rest of the east was pretty much immune of this draft evasion phenomenon, unlike the west. And if you think of, and if we can think of the earliest rates of draft evasion, especially when this law was implemented in 1861, so the earliest rate of draft evasion on the earliest court that was called up as a proxy for trust in the central government, then there's already some gap between eastern and western Sicily, with draft evasion from the very first court being much higher in the west compared to the east. So there was some pre-existing gap in attitudes, as you were correctly suggesting before the repression. And that's something that maybe was just incremented with the repression. So yeah, that's what I have. Thanks.
Yes, no, very interesting. Let me check. Yeah, I think we've addressed all the questions. I think this was a very interesting presentation and a very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
So I want to thank you both. So let me conclude by saying a few words on behalf of myself and the online economic history workshop conference organizers. I want to thank Gianni Marciante for sharing his research with us, and thank you also Felipe Valencia Caicedo for your thoughts and comments on the presenter's research. I also want to thank the audience for taking the time to join us today and for the insightful questions that they were asking. They certainly improve research and advance our understanding of the past. Today's panel concludes the 2022 online economic history workshop. To learn more about future workshops, including workshop theme, submission deadlines, and viewing schedule, go to www.oehw.org and sign up for email notifications. With that, I declare the 2022 online economic history workshop closed. Good day.